Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I'm Evelyn Marcus.
And I'm Phyllis Dimbler-Miller.
As we approach Yom Kippur 2023, we think back to 50 years ago when news broke during Yom Kippur on October 6, 1973, that Israel had been attacked by Syria in the north and Egypt in the south. To honor that war for survival, we have a special podcast today. We not only have a guest speaker, but also a guest moderator. Our guest moderator is Michael Berenbaum, PhD and rabbi. He is the director of the Ziggy Ziering Institute for Exploring the Ethical and Religious Implications of the Holocaust, and a professor of Jewish studies at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. He is the author and editor of 18 books, and he was the executive editor of the new Encyclopedia Judaica. He was our guest before in our episode 51 about confronting European youth with Auschwitz. Michael brings Rick Richman as his guest today. Rick Richman is a resident scholar at American Jewish University and the author of 2 books on Zionism. Most recently, he published And None Shall Make Them Afraid. He has written for Commentary Magazine, Mosaic, The New York Sun, The Jewish Journal, Jewish Press, New York Post, PG Media, and other publications. His website is www.rickrichrman.net. Michael and Rick, thank you so much for coming on our show. We're excited and honored, and we're excited to hear your discussion about the Yom Kippur War. The mic is yours.
Rick, first of all, I'm going to call you by your first name because we're good friends and we work with each other all the time. So I won't call you by any formal title, but it's a pleasure to have you with us. Rick, set the stage for the Yom Kippur War and bring us back 50 years in time. And then we'll talk about some of the controversies surrounding the Yom Kippur War.
The war started on October 6th in the morning in the United States. It was a double holy day. It was not only Yom Kippur that day, it was Shabbat. And Israel was basically shut down as much as it could be. It had the minimal defense people in place. Soldiers were in synagogue or at home. Israel did not expect there to be a war, even though they had witnessed these troop buildups by both Egypt and Syria. But they had been buildups before, in the months before. And each time it required Israel to mobilize its reserves. And mobilizing the reserves in Israel is to basically shut down the economy, because basically you have the IDF and the reservists. And so every time they did that, there was an economic cost. And even the CIA formally advised President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, that they did not expect a war with this latest mobilization. They thought it was another training exercise or an attempt to get Israel to mobilize its own reserves and have an economic cost. They didn't expect a war. The people around Golda Meir, the prime minister, did not expect a war. Even at the highest levels, such as Moshe Dayan, the hero of the 1967 Six-Day War. And this is the 50th anniversary of that war breaking out. But even more important than it being the 50th anniversary, I think it's important for us to recognize that Israel was only 25 years old at that point. And it had already been through 3 wars. The 1948 War of Independence, in which 1% of the population was killed. 1% of the United States population today would be over 3 million people. And so that's how traumatic, even though victorious, that war was. And then you had 1956, another war in conjunction with Britain and France against Egypt to try and stop Egypt's military activities against Israel. And then in 1967, of course, you had the Six-Day War, which was an existential threat. So
let me
Israel.
let me add a couple of things, right? Just it's interesting that it broke out on Yom Kippur because, ironically, it was also a very important day on the Muslim calendar, and that was the day after Ramadan. And Ramadan is a time in which the Muslims fast from sunrise to darkness, and this was the day after Ramadan. But having occurred on Yom Kippur, it had a particular offense. It sort of was almost disdain for Judaism's most holy day. And ironically, even though Israel was ill-prepared for the war, and we'll talk about why it was ill-prepared for the war, ironically, it occurring on Yom Kippur helped Israel in a very peculiar way because they could mobilize all of their troops. They knew where everybody was, and the streets were empty. The army could move about freely. There was no traffic on the highway to Tel Aviv or on the highway to Jerusalem because Yom Kippur in Israel, either you go to synagogue or you stay home. There is very little traffic, very little, almost no commerce, and everything is quite empty. Let's talk for a moment about, well, let's bring our audience up into the implications of what occurred during the Yom Kippur War, and then you and I will talk about the implications of the Yom Kippur War. Continue, Rick, please.
Despite the fact that Israel knew where its soldiers were on that day, the losses in the first 2 days of that war were staggering. They lost 400 tanks. They lost 49 planes. They called the United States, Kissinger, to say, we need help, which is an unusual thing for Israel to do. So immediately, that was the second day. And in the United States, we were in the middle of a constitutional crisis. Kissinger had just been confirmed as Secretary of State 2 weeks before, so he was new to the position. Nixon was not in Washington when the war broke out. He was in Florida dealing with the resignation of his vice president, Spiro Agnew. On October 19th, 10 days into the war.
This was also in the midst of the Watergate controversy as well, and Nixon was in a, what shall we say, not yet fatally wounded, but in a deeply wounded political position.
Absolutely. So the United States was unprepared. As I say, the CIA predicted there would be no war. Nixon was in Florida. Kissinger was at home. Abba Eban calls him at 6:40 a.m. Eastern time to tell him that Israel has just learned there's going to be a war later that day. They only had like 6 hours of notice. And Kissinger, between 6:40 a.m. and 9 a.m., has spoken with not only Abba Eban more than once, but the Soviet ambassador, the UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim, Brent Scowcroft, the national security advisor, the Egyptian foreign minister. So the mobilization by Kissinger of the United States government, while Nixon was in Florida, certainly with Nixon's knowledge and consent, but it was Kissinger who, on a Saturday morning, mobilized the U.S. government to support Israel.
Can I ask for a clarification? Abba Eban was Israel's ambassador to UN at that time. Is that correct?
No, he was foreign minister at that time.
He had held the position previously of U.S. ambassador, simultaneously being UN ambassador so he held both positions simultaneously, and then he had become foreign minister, and on this day he was the foreign minister.
And
Abba Eban, ironically, at that point was in the United States, because
was.
he was there for the General Assembly.
And what was the warning? When he knew at 6:40 a.m., you said they only had 6 hours. How did they know it finally?
Israel intelligence had picked up a warning, and we should talk a bit about the mood in Israel prior to that, because Israel had had this massive and unexpected victory in the 1967 war and felt itself virtually infallible. And again, Moshe Dayan was the defense minister. He had come in as defense minister after the in the days just before the 6-Day War, because people did not have confidence in the then Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, and he was regarded, and Rick and I will agree on this, mistakenly, as the great hero of the 6-Day War. And it seemed like Israel was infallible. The Arabs would never attack Israel. And there also was, over the Egyptian Suez Canal, there was the Bar-Lev line, and Israel felt itself virtually infallible. There were, if the CIA made a mistake in predicting war, Israel's vaunted intelligence system, which picked up signals that the war was about to begin, also made significant mistakes in overestimating its military capability, overestimating what was required to defend the Israel position in Sinai, and also, most importantly, presuming that the signals of war were not real, and dramatic and significant mistakes. These were all agreed upon by the commission that investigated the Yom Kippur War afterwards. So I'm not saying anything that is in any way historically controversial. And if I did, my friend Rick Richman would certainly correct me. But this is the setting for it. Take us through the Yom Kippur War.
Not to correct you, but to add to what you've just said, the psychology in Israel at the time was they couldn't believe that the Arabs would risk another war 6 years after they had been defeated so convincingly in the 1967 Six-Day War. So part of it was even if they got warnings and they saw the troop buildups, they knew about the troop buildups. It wasn't a surprise in that sense. They just couldn't believe it that Anwar Sadat would risk a war. And so some people say it was Israeli hubris. They were overconfident. I would say it was more than they thought at this point. They had gone through these mobilization threats, and they couldn't believe that what they were seeing would be another real war initiated by the Arabs. Interestingly enough, to go to your question, Michael, when the war started, the Egyptian foreign minister called the United States and told them that Israel had started it, that Israel had attacked at a location south of the Suez Canal, or in the southern part below the Suez Canal. And so they had a false story about how things had started. And so Israel was dealing with that. And one of the heroes, I'm sure we'll get to Golda Meir in a second, because Golda is, in my view, the hero. But one of the other heroes was Abba Eban,
Golda Meir was the prime minister. Abba Eban was the foreign minister.
Correct. And Abba Eban was on the phone with Kissinger, and Kissinger told him that Egypt had just informed him that Israel had attacked. And Abba Eban said, that's ridiculous. On Yom Kippur, when nobody is available, when everything shut down, that would be the day when we would start a new general war. It was ridiculous. And he said, but I'll check with the prime minister and I'll get back to you. 20 minutes later, he calls Kissinger back, and he says, the prime minister has a rich Hebrew vocabulary, and she poured it out. And she wants me to assure you that is absolutely false. So the communications, even in an age before cell phones and the internet, was almost instantaneous between Kissinger, Abba Eban, and Golda Meir. And there's probably never going to be a movie called Abba. If it is, it'll be about a singing group, not about Abba Eban. But he was one of the heroes of this story, along with Golda. I would say those are the two, along with Kissinger from the United States, and Nixon.
And Nixon. So let's take us through very briefly, because I want to talk about the implications of the Yom Kippur War. The war goes badly at the very beginning. One would say not badly, but catastrophically. And then we have Moshe Dayan, the great hero, panicking. And tell us that story.
Put Golda Meir in the position she was in as prime minister. She's surrounded by men. She's surrounded by men with military experience, of which she has none. She has no higher education. She moved from the United States to Israel when she was 21 years old. And not only that, but the military men have this stellar reputation, typified by Moshe Dayan, the hero of the 1967 war. And when the war starts, in contradiction to all the assurances she had gotten from the heads of the military establishment, Moshe Dayan had what most people call now a mental breakdown. He ran around saying the Third Temple, Israel, is about to be destroyed. And so Golda Meir, under these circumstances, had to keep her cool, number one. Number two, evaluate the information that was coming in, seeing the losses that had happened. She had to decide whether they had about 6 hours, I would say, of warning, whether to authorize a preemptive attack. And she decided not to. And one of the things that emerged after the war was Kissinger telling her, it's good you did not authorize a preemptive attack, because we could not have supported Israel the way we did had Israel initiated this war again 6 years after the Six-Day War. So Golda's decision-making...
Let's explain that for 1 second. During the Six-Day War, Israel felt itself was surrounded. The UN troops had withdrawn from the Sinai, and the reality is that Israel discovered a breach in Egyptian military preparedness, and that is at 7:30 in the morning. One group of pilots went to breakfast, and the other group of pilots did not yet get up in defensive positions, discovered that peculiar breach in military, and that's the moment at which it wiped out the entire Egyptian Air Force on the ground. So they had taken in 1967, after enormous provocation, they had taken a preemptive attack, which was enormously successful. So, but again, if Israel had taken a preemptive attack, it appeared in America that Israel was all powerful at that point, was picking on, a defeated army, and it would have created a whole range of problems to marshal American support.
Right. And let's look at the war from America's standpoint for just a second, from Kissinger's standpoint, because Israel obviously is fighting what it quickly realizes is an existential battle. Kissinger, who's woken up at 6:40 in the morning with news of this, is facing multiple issues. He needs to support an American ally. He needs to be sure that a Soviet ally does not defeat an American ally. He needs to do it in a way that does not generate a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And he has to leave space for there to be a peace process after this war ends, hopefully in Israel's favor.
And so he has a weakened president.
He has a weakened president,
and he's new to the job. And also, there's a sensitivity, because Kissinger at that point was the first man, in his words, of Jewish origin to be Secretary of State of the United States.
Correct.
And
he's
those of us who've seen Golda know the famous line, which is absolutely part of the folklore, but may also be true, which is Kissinger says, "I'm here as Secretary of State, as an American, and also as a Jew." And Golda says to him, "But in Hebrew we read right to left," which is again part of the rapport that the rapport that they had.
One of the interesting things about the historical record is that Kissinger recorded all of his conversations, and he decades later wrote a book called Crisis, an analysis of two major foreign policy events, the first one being the Yom Kippur War. And so we have the actual words, some of which Michael's just quoted, between Kissinger and everybody, including 4 conversations on the very first day with Abba Eban. So we have the historical record. And one of the things Kissinger said immediately was, if Israel feels, this is a quote from Kissinger, if Israel feels we've let them down and the Arabs think they did this themselves, and the Soviet Union has a victory over the United States and one of its allies, we're sunk. That's what he said. So he was dealing immediately with a major foreign policy issue, even beyond the Middle East crisis that he was dealing with as well. And we have the record because we have the actual transcripts of what was said at the time. So it's not somebody explaining how they won the war 5 years later. We have the transcripts of what was said.
And Israel becomes desperate for military resupply.
Correct.
And that's a moment where Israel itself felt another existential crisis, because Israel, as you said, "and none shall make them afraid" is the title of your book. That's a moment at which every Israeli was deeply afraid, because they understood, and every Israeli leader was deeply afraid, because they understood without resupply of military equipment, of arms and ammunition, and all that they had lost, they would lose the war, and that would have resulted in an absolute catastrophe. And ironically, the decision on that depended on 3 people: the President of the United States, who may have been pro-Israel, certainly anti-Soviet, but has a record that one could say is questionable regarding Jews. One could say that privately he was anti-Semitic, at least toward many Jews. A Secretary of Defense, James Schlesinger, who himself had converted from Judaism to Lutheranism at college at Harvard, and a Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who was the first Jew to occupy that position, but who at that point spoke of himself as of Jewish origin, which was a peculiar code word for Jews from Germany, about a strong measure of assimilation. And Israel, ironically, found itself dependent on the goodwill of the United States, which had its own interest not only in an Israel victory, but in a Soviet defeat.
Correct. And Nixon immediately ordered a massive resupply operation for Israel. And a week later, Israel was not getting the material. There was a slowdown, whether intentional or not, in the Defense Department in actually sending the material or sending as much as Israel needed. And Kissinger called over to the Defense Department and said, any defense official who doesn't back this wholeheartedly should resign. That's what he said. And so it was not simply Nixon ordering it or Kissinger passing along the order, but making sure it was implemented. And then when the Soviet Union saw what was happening, they started moving in the direction of sending troops, Soviet troops, to support Egypt. And that's when Nixon raised the U.S. defense level to DEFCON 3, the highest defense level in peacetime that the United States could do.
And
So
that coincided with what was known as the Saturday Night Massacre,
correct. The Saturday
in which Elliot Richardson resigned and rather than fire Archibald Cox, and you ended up going down to third person in the Justice Department. Elliot Richardson was then Attorney General, and William Ruckelshaus was Deputy Attorney General, and you ended up going down to third person in the Justice Department to fire Archibald Cox, who was Robert Bork.
So look what happened. This is 2 weeks after the war. 2 weeks after the war started, you've got an oil embargo by Saudi Arabia and all the major oil producers. The price of oil triples. Then the next day, you've got what Michael described, the Saturday Night Massacre, in which Nixon fires the people in the Justice Department he's in the middle of a constitutional crisis. And then 5 days after that, the Soviets start moving their troops toward the Middle East. So we're in the middle of a major constitutional crisis in the United States when all this is happening.
And a geopolitical military crisis of the highest magnitude.
Correct.
A time for the president to be quite asleep and relaxed.
Correct.
Tremendous thing. Let's take through. Israel then turns it around. Resupplied, it turns it around, and Ariel Sharon makes a daring move, which is to go over the Suez Canal and to ultimately surround the Third Army. And then Henry Kissinger steps in, and let's talk about what Kissinger at that point did after Israel had done a Herculean military job to be able to recover and to go on the offense, to also recover at the Suez, at the Golan Heights with regard to Syria. And ironically, unlike the Six-Day War, Jordan stayed out of this war, and it had been defeated and accepted, as it were, its defeat, and was not prepared to attack on a third front.
What Kissinger was faced with all of a sudden was too much Israeli success too soon, and the possibility that humiliating Egypt completely would be counterproductive for peace in the Middle East and might generate Soviet intervention, which might generate a further war. And Ariel Sharon, in one of the boldest military maneuvers in Israeli history, had gone behind the Third Army of Egypt as they crossed the canal into the Sinai, and he cut off the Third Army, and he had 35,000 troops who were facing extinction. And Kissinger wanted there to be, in effect, a stop at that point so that there could be...
Let's explain extinction. They essentially, in military terms, in real estate, they say location, location, location. In military terms, you can say logistics, logistics, logistics. And that is, there was no way to supply them, no way to supply them with food, no way to supply them with water. And even if Israel had done nothing, the Third Army would have essentially been extinguished because it could not eat, it could not drink, and the like. And then Kissinger, who's playing chess in a dramatic way, take us through it, Rick.
Well, Kissinger, wanted there to be, in effect, a situation where the hostilities could stop, and for the first time, an Arab country would be talking directly to Israel about a ceasefire and beyond a ceasefire. So Kissinger saw that it was not simply the protection of Israel, not simply the stopping of a war, not even simply the United States replacing the Soviet Union in the Middle East as the major power. It was also an opportunity to move a peace process into place. And that's what he did. And in the movie Golda, which I do recommend that everybody who hasn't seen it see, there's a scene with Kissinger, played by Liev Schreiber, and Golda, played by Helen Mirren.
Played beyond brilliantly by Helen Mirren.
And that scene, which is abbreviated, obviously, in my view, having read the actual words, is a pretty fair portrayal of what happened. Kissinger came, and he was giving what in a sense was bad news to Golda Meir, that Israel, which had been surprised and massive losses of men and material, was supposed to stop and allow the Egyptian army to survive and not take it further. And Kissinger goes to Golda Meir, and if you'll allow me, I'll just read you the actual words of that scene, because they're actually quite moving. Kissinger is alone with Golda Meir, and he says, "Madam Prime Minister," I'm quoting now, "Madam Prime Minister, we are faced with a very tragic situation. You didn't start the war, but you face a need for wise decisions to protect the survival of Israel. This is what you face. This is my honest judgment as a friend." And Golda Meir's voice is shaking as she responds. She says, "You're saying we have no choice? You're saying we have to accept the judgment of the U.S.? We have to accept your judgment, even on our own affairs, on what is best for us?" And Kissinger says, "We all have to accept the judgment of other nations. We're deferring to your judgment." So he handled that situation with extraordinary diplomatic skill, and Golda Meir rose to an occasion with unimaginable courage and commitment and judgment. She's still popular in the United States. She's still unpopular in Israel because people blame her for the war, even though, as Michael says, the Agranat Commission cleared her. She was relying upon the advice of her defense establishment. But it's hard to believe anybody else but she could have risen in the way that she did, with the personal relationship she had with Kissinger and Nixon, who both respected her. The war could have turned out differently. It's a good indication of what I'm trying to convey in my book, which is that history is not these massive impersonal forces, but they're what individuals do.
But her courage, ironically, was not to go for complete victory.
Correct.
And to understand, as it were, and this is one of the implications of the Yom Kippur War, to understand that the notion of full and complete independence in an interdependent universe may have been a dream of the Zionist movement, may have been a dream of the people who founded the State of Israel, but the reality on the ground in the world is much more complex. I want to go through very briefly, Rick. 4 years later, Anwar Sadat comes to Israel, and essentially we end up with the Egyptian Accords. Let's look at that for a moment. That occurred essentially not because Sadat loved Israel all of a sudden, but because Sadat understood that, as it were, it was always going to be checkmate. And that is, it was always going to be essentially, he was not going to win. If he didn't win this time, he was not going to win. Therefore, there had to be another way. And in a very real sense, he came there also because Jimmy Carter made an interesting and important mistake. And Carter ends up being a hero of the Camp David Accords. But the mistake that Carter made was he wanted to reintroduce the Soviet Union into the Middle East. And Sadat had expelled Soviet advisors, felt that he had been misled all the way through, and ended up, in one sense, making his determination that the only way forward was with peace, however cold, with Israel. Let's do one more thing in the brief time we have allotted to us. And I'm going to say something quite provocative, and you'll probably disagree with me, but that's common. That's ordinary and common to our conversations. But we disagree vehemently without being disagreeable with one another, which may be a model of the way in which the world must go forward. I've argued that we're still fighting the 6-Day War. And it could be that at this very moment, the Yom Kippur War is coming to an end in a very dramatic way. And that is that we were worried in 1973, and let's go back to 73. We were worried that power in the future was going to reside in the control of natural resources. And what we've discovered in the last 50 years is that there's a second measure of power, and that's the knowledge-based economy and the knowledge-based world. And in that, Israel is really can hold its own with any country, and per capita is doing probably better than any other country in the world in a knowledge-based economy. And with what may happen with Saudi Arabia, which is changing from the being thoroughly dependent on the control of natural resources, oil. What's happening with Saudi Arabia is they may be coming to the determination that their future lies in a knowledge-based world. And therefore they have to come to terms and accept Israel. And that may mean that the Yom Kippur War has ultimate implications.
Well, to my great surprise, I agree with everything you just said, Michael. And I would, in response, I think, because I know we're coming close to the end, I want to just say one thing, and this is directly in response to what you just said, that Abba Eban told the UN on the second day of the war. This is while Israel has not yet turned the tide. They're still in an existential threat. And Abba Eban ends his speech to the UN by saying the following, and this is a direct quote: "At this very solemn and tragic hour, we cannot help but think back upon the waste and the anguish and the avoidable suffering of the past 2 decades. All our Arab neighbors together, which are developing countries, have spent in this period something like $20,000 million on war. The result, nothing. The achievement, nothing. The tiniest fraction of that expenditure would have been sufficient to solve all the refugee problems in the Middle East 50 times over." And this is in the middle of a war that Israel is presenting this attitude. And I agree with you, Michael. We're still in the 7th day of the 6-Day War, and things are changing slowly. We've had peace treaties with Jordan and Egypt. We've had the Abraham Accords. The Saudis appear to see strategically where their real future lies. It's taken a long, long time, but no one...
And nobody's suggesting returning any territory to Syria, which has become an outlier among the nations.
Correct.
Deservedly so.
So it's good that we are memorializing the 50th anniversary of the war, because it's not simply history. It's as Faulkner said, it's not the past is not dead. It's not even past. It's still with us. And there are a lot of lessons that we've been able to cover, I think, today that people should be aware of.
And we have resurrected the reputation of Abba Eban and Golda Meir. We'll turn it back to you, Phyllis.
Yes, okay. I think those are actually very good last thoughts. So we're going to end this now. Thank you, Michael and Rick. This was an amazing, amazing discussion. We're so thrilled to have you on. We're thrilled for our listeners to be with us. For those of you who want to know more about Evelyn and myself and our other projects, you can go to Never Again Is Now podcast on YouTube channel, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And as we end every show, we say, please, without putting yourself in physical harm, speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.